Right now, if you look at a map of the world, you're looking at the result of one of the most unlikely journeys in the history of life on Earth. Humans started in Africa. That part most people know, but what most people don't fully grasp is what that actually means. Because Africa to Australia is roughly 8,000 miles. Africa to the tip of South America is over 10,000. And the people who made those journeys didn't have compasses, or maps, or metal tools, or domesticated animals to carry their gear. They had stone, fire, and each other. And somehow, within a geologically short window of time, they covered almost every corner of the planet. How that happened is one of the most remarkable stories in human history, and the answer is more surprising than most people expect. Let's start with the basic timeline, because the numbers matter here. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, evolved in Africa somewhere around 300,000 years ago. For the first 100,000 or so years, most of that activity stayed within the continent. Then, roughly 70,000 years ago, something shifted. A small group, and when researchers say small, they mean possibly just a few hundred individuals, crossed out of Africa and into the Arabian Peninsula. That crossing point was probably what's now the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a narrow channel between the Horn of Africa and what is today Yemen. At certain points during the last ice age, sea levels were low enough that this crossing may have been only a few miles wide. That's it. A few miles of open water standing between Africa and the rest of the world. Now here's where it gets interesting. Once that group made it across, they didn't stop. Within the next several thousand years, their descendants had spread all the way to South Asia, Southeast Asia, and eventually Australia. That's a migration of thousands of miles happening across what feels like a blink of time in geological terms. And the leading theory for how they moved that fast is actually pretty simple. They followed the coast. Coastlines offered something that the interior of a continent couldn't always guarantee: consistent food. The ocean is full of shellfish, fish, and marine mammals. Rivers leading inland from the coast are full of fresh water and game. If you stay near the water and keep moving, you can cover enormous distances without ever going hungry for long. Archaeologists call this the Southern Coastal Route, and the genetic evidence from modern populations lines up with it almost exactly. But following a coast still takes generations. No single person walked from Africa to Southeast Asia. What actually happened was more like a slow expansion, where each generation pushed a little further into new territory, settled, had children, and then some of those children pushed further still. At that pace, even modest movement adds up fast. If a group expands its range by just a few miles per year, over the course of 1,000 years, that's thousands of miles of new ground covered. The speed of this migration wasn't about individual travelers walking enormous distances. It was about populations gradually filling in the edges of the habitable world, generation after generation, without any of them knowing they were part of something that large. And the terrain they crossed was nothing like what we'd see on a map today. During the last ice age, sea levels were dramatically lower, in some places by more than 300 feet. Large portions of what are now shallow coastal seas were dry land. The continental shelf off Southeast Asia, a region called Sundaland, was a connected landmass roughly the size of Western Europe. What is now the Indonesian archipelago was mostly a single large peninsula. Getting from mainland Asia to what is now Papua New Guinea or northern Australia still required crossing open water, but the distances involved were much shorter than they are today. The ocean crossings that ancient humans had to make were genuinely impressive, but they were working with a world that made those crossings more achievable than they'd be. Right now. Which still leaves the question of how they got across the water at all, because even with lower sea levels, reaching Australia required multiple open ocean crossings. The minimum distance, even under the most favorable conditions during the Ice Age, was somewhere around 55 to 90 kilometers of open water. That's not something you stumble across by accident. It requires intentional navigation, and it requires some kind of watercraft. No wooden boats from that period have survived, which makes sense because wood doesn't last 65,000 years. But we know those crossings happened, because the genetic and archaeological evidence for humans in Australia goes back at least 65,000 years. That means people were building seaworthy watercraft before the invention of writing, before agriculture, before pottery. Whatever they were using, it worked. Let's talk about what those early watercraft might have looked like. The simplest option would have been something like a bamboo raft. Bamboo is naturally buoyant, grows quickly and abundantly across tropical Asia, and can be lashed together with plant fibers. A raft large enough to carry several people, with a simple sail made from leaves or woven plant material, could cover 90 kilometers in a matter of days. And there's good reason to think these weren't desperate solo crossings. Establishing a viable population somewhere new requires more than one person. You need enough genetic diversity to sustain a group across generations, which means those early ocean crossings were probably made by groups of people, not lone explorers. Someone organized that. Someone looked at the horizon and convinced a group of people to get on a raft and paddle toward it, What's remarkable is that Australia wasn't the end of it. From there, populations eventually spread south across the continent, and over the following tens of thousands of years, the descendants of those early arrivals developed cultures, languages, and technologies specifically adapted to one of the harshest environments on Earth. The Australian interior is brutally hot, often waterless, and enormous. The fact that people not only survived it but thrived across every region of the continent is a testament to just how good early humans already were at reading and adapting to unfamiliar landscapes, even without any of the tools we'd consider necessary today. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, a completely separate migration route was pushing north and east across Central Asia. These groups moved through what is now Iran, Afghanistan, and into the vast steppes of Central Eurasia. The conditions here were brutal in a completely different way. Cold, dry, open grasslands stretching in every direction. To survive it, people needed reliable shelter, warm clothing made from animal hides, and the ability to track and hunt large herd animals across enormous distances. Bone needles found at archaeological sites in Siberia dating back more than 45,000 years show that people were already making fitted clothing. That detail is easy to overlook, but it's significant. Fitted clothing means you can move into cold environments that would otherwise kill you. It's one of the things that made the northern route possible. And the northern route eventually led somewhere extraordinary, about 20,000 years ago, or possibly earlier depending on which evidence you find most convincing. People had made it all the way to northeastern Siberia, and from northeastern Siberia, they were close to something that no longer exists, a land bridge connecting Asia to North America. During the peak of the last ice age, so much water was locked up in glaciers that sea levels dropped enough to expose a stretch of land across what is now the Bering Strait. This land bridge, called Beringia, wasn't a narrow strip of land. It was a broad, flat, treeless expanse hundreds of miles wide, home to woolly mammoths, horses, and bison. People lived there, possibly for thousands of years, before eventually pushing south into the Americas. How they pushed south is still debated. The traditional model had people walking through an ice-free corridor that opened up between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets as the glaciers retreated. But more recent evidence suggests at least some of the initial movement into the Americas happened along the Pacific coast, the same coastal route model that worked so well in Asia. Kelp forests along the coastline of the Americas supported rich ecosystems full of marine life, and people who already knew how to live near the water could have followed that resource corridor all the way down the coast. Within a few thousand years of the first arrivals, humans had reached the southern tip of South America. That's roughly 10,000 miles of new continent covered in what may be as little as and years. What allowed people to move that fast? Part of it was simply that the Americas were empty of other humans. There was no competition for territory, no established populations to push back against. The land was full of large animals that had never seen a human being, and had no instinct to fear one. Early hunters could walk up to a mammoth that had never learned to run from anything, and had relatively straightforward access to hundreds of pounds of meat. That kind of resource abundance doesn't last forever, but in the short term, it's a powerful engine for population growth and expansion. More people means more pressure to move into new areas, and with abundant food fueling that growth, the expansion moved fast. Now, all of this movement raises an obvious question. How did people actually know where to go? They didn't have maps. They had no way of knowing what was on the other side of a mountain range or beyond the horizon of an ocean. But that framing misunderstands how exploration actually works at this scale. Nobody was trying to cross a continent. They were looking for food, water, and safe places to shelter. Local knowledge, built up over generations, told people which direction rivers flowed, where animals migrated seasonally, which passes through mountain ranges were usable in which seasons. That knowledge was passed down and built upon, layer by layer, across hundreds of generations. By the time a group was standing at the edge of the Bering Land Bridge, they already had thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about how to survive in cold, open environments. They weren't venturing common's birth of Mountain Forceau. Into the unknown blind. They were applying everything they'd already learned. There's also strong evidence that early humans were better at reading natural navigation cues than we tend to give them credit for. Stars, wind direction, ocean currents, the behavior of birds, the color and temperature of the water, wave patterns on the surface of the sea. Polynesian navigators, who colonized remote islands across the Pacific thousands of years later, could read ocean swells and determine their latitude and direction with remarkable accuracy without any instruments at all. That knowledge didn't appear out of nowhere. It was built on tens of thousands of years of accumulated human experience with the natural world. The people making these early migrations were paying close attention to everything around them, and they were extremely good at it. Let's talk about what made Homo sapiens specifically so capable of pulling this off, because other human species had chances to do something similar and didn't manage it at anything like the same scale. Neanderthals were in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years and never made it significantly beyond the edges of Eurasia. Homo erectus spread out of Africa nearly 2 million years ago and reached as far as Java, which is genuinely impressive, but their range never pushed into Australia or the Americas. What separated us seems to have been the ability to maintain complex social networks across large distances, allowing knowledge, materials, and innovation to move between groups that had never met face to face. Obsidian from specific volcanic sources has been found at archaeological sites hundreds of miles away from where that obsidian originated. That's not a single person carrying a rock. That's a trade network, a web of relationships stretching across a landscape, passing materials from hand to hand over generations. And that network structure made human populations resilient in a way that isolated groups never could be. When a drought hit one region, groups with connections to distant communities could draw on knowledge or resources from somewhere the drought hadn't reached. When a hunting technique proved effective, it could spread across hundreds of miles in a few generations. When a new environment threw something unexpected at a group of people, someone somewhere in the network had probably already encountered something similar. That's not just an advantage. In the long run, it's the difference between surviving and not. There's another piece of this that doesn't get talked about enough, and that's the role of population pressure in driving migration in the first place. For most of human history, populations were small and widely spread. But even modest population growth creates pressure on local resources. When a group gets too large for the food supply in a given area to support, some of those people move. They push into adjacent territory, test new environments, and gradually extend the edges of where humans live. Over thousands of years, that pressure is relentless. It doesn't require anyone to be adventurous or visionary. It just requires that populations grow slightly faster than they can be sustained in one place, and the result is a slow but unstoppable expansion across the surface of the planet. And yet, even accounting for all of that, the sheer scale of what happened still feels almost implausible. Within roughly 50,000 years of leaving Africa, humans had reached Australia, Europe, Siberia, and the Americas. They'd crossed open ocean, survived glacial winters, hunted megafauna across multiple continents, and established cultures on nearly every landmass on Earth. They did it without metal, without agriculture, without written language. They did it with the same basic cognitive hardware you're using right now to follow this story. The tools changed along the way, but the minds driving the whole thing stayed essentially the same from the beginning. The last major frontier in this story is actually one of the most recent. The remote islands of Polynesia, scattered across the central and eastern Pacific, were among the last places on Earth to be settled by humans. The Hawaiian Islands weren't reached until roughly 1,000 years ago. New Zealand, even more recently than that. These weren't migrations driven by land bridges or coastal routes. They were deliberate deep ocean voyages, made in double-hulled canoes, navigated by people reading stars and waves, carrying plants, animals, and everything needed to establish a new settlement on an island they'd never seen. By any reasonable measure, those voyages represent the pinnacle of what human navigation had been building toward across tens of thousands of years. A species that once crossed a few miles of shallow water on a bamboo raft had eventually developed the knowledge and technology to cross thousands of miles of open Pacific and find a tiny island on the other side.